The Haunting of Cabin 13. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as the car rolled to a stop, the trees closing in like a pair of silent sentinels. Off the grid, that's what the brochure said. A place to unwind, escape the world, leave behind the buzzing demands of modern life. That's what we were after, peace. But the second I stepped out of the car, I felt it. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The cabin stood ahead, framed by the looming woods. It wasn't the quaint little getaway we'd imagined. The wood was cracked and bleached gray, the windows clouded with grime, and the air smelled faintly of damp rot. It didn't look like anyone had been here in years. I shot a glance toward the cabin, then back at the car, wondering if we should just turn around. But we had driven 4 hours to this remote corner of nowhere, and I wasn't about to admit that something as simple as a decrepit old cabin was giving me second thoughts. My wife clung to her bag, giving me a small, uncertain smile.
"I guess it's more rustic than we thought," she said.
"Yeah, rustic," I muttered, stepping up the rickety porch steps. Each creak felt like a warning, but I brushed it off. That's the thing about old wood, right? It groans, it creaks. No big deal. Still, there was something off. The place had a heaviness, like the air was thicker here, harder to breathe. It didn't take long to notice the silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Inside, the cabin was dim, shadows clinging to the corners like spiders waiting to pounce. The windows were smeared with dirt, barely letting in any light. It smelled worse inside. Damp wood, mildew, and something else. Something sweet and metallic that hung faintly in the air. But the fireplace was intact, the furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. And for a moment, we managed to laugh about how we'd clean it up and make it cozy. We unpacked quickly, eager to shake off the unease that had settled over us. As the sun sank behind the trees, casting long, spindly shadows across the room, I set to work on the fireplace. The fire crackled to life, sending flickering shadows dancing across the walls. For a moment, the place almost felt normal. That night, it started. The first sound was faint, barely noticeable over the popping of the firewood. I sat up, straining to hear. It was like something scraping, dragging across the floor. I glanced toward the front door. The old lock was rusted, barely holding. I told myself it was nothing. A raccoon, maybe, or the wind knocking branches around. I tried to settle back into sleep. Then it came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate scraping, as if something was dragging itself along the wooden floor, inching closer. My wife stirred beside me, her breath quickening. She had heard it too. I whispered, "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide in the dim firelight. It stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Every second dragged on, waiting, listening. And then the door moved. Not a knock, no. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone or something was pushing it open. The hairs on my arms prickled, a cold sweat breaking out along my back. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the door. Nothing. The door was still shut, the lock still rusted in place. But I could feel it, that heavy, oppressive feeling, like the room itself was holding its breath. We didn't sleep much that night. The next morning we found the journal. It was hidden beneath a floorboard in the small, crooked kitchen. The journal was old, its cover cracked and brittle, pages curled and yellowed with time. At first, I didn't want to open it. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been left there for a reason, like whatever was inside wasn't meant to be read. But curiosity won out, and we sat together by the weak morning light, flipping through its pages. The writing was shaky, frantic, as if the writer had been rushing, desperate to get the words down. We weren't the first. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. The entries that followed were worse, page after page, detailing strange occurrences, noises at night, doors moving on their own, shadows that seemed to stretch and reach out toward the living. The writer described a man, a hermit who had lived here decades ago, who had died here, alone and angry, and now his spirit lingered. The last entry was a warning. He wants more. Once you stay, you become his, part of the cycle. You will never leave. No one leaves. The door creaked behind us. We both froze, staring at the journal, our hearts pounding in our chests. I turned slowly toward the door. It was open, wide open. And I swear, though it was broad daylight, the world beyond that threshold seemed darker, like something was waiting just outside. Something that had already let itself in. The door hung open, its hinges swaying slightly, though there was no wind. The fire had gone out sometime during the night, leaving the room colder than it should have been. I couldn't stop staring at the doorway, my mind trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the lock had finally given way, or we hadn't shut it tight enough the night before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I could feel it. The wrongness in the air, thick and suffocating, like the cabin was breathing with us, aware of us. My wife sat still beside me, clutching the journal, her fingers pale from gripping the edges too hard. She hadn't said a word since the door creaked open. It was as though we both knew, instinctively, that acknowledging it would somehow make it worse. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. "We need to leave," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now," I nodded. We packed in record time, barely speaking, just moving with purpose. Every second in that place felt like it was pushing down on us, like the walls were closing in. I avoided looking out the windows, certain that if I did, I'd see something watching. But when we tried to start the car, the engine sputtered once and then died. I tried again, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the wheel. Nothing. Dead. "We're stranded," I muttered, my voice sounding strange in the eerie quiet of the forest. "Maybe it's just the battery?" she offered, though we both knew it wasn't that simple. Her voice was shaky. A thin veil of calm stretched over panic. The woods around the cabin felt wrong too. Too quiet. Too still. As if the trees themselves were listening. Watching. I yanked the keys out of the ignition and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under my boots, unnaturally loud in the dead silence. I circled to the front of the car, popped the hood, and stared uselessly at the engine. I wasn't much of a mechanic, and even if I had been, it wouldn't have mattered. The car wasn't going anywhere. Behind me, I heard her footsteps approach. I turned, about to say something. I don't even know what. But the words died in my throat when I saw her face. She was pale, her eyes wide, staring at something just beyond me. "What is it?" I asked, my voice tight. She didn't answer, just pointed. Slowly, I turned and followed her gaze. There, scrawled across the hood of the car in thick black streaks, were 3 words. "Leave. Now." The letters dripped, oozing down the metal like fresh blood. I stumbled back, my stomach flipping. That smell. That sweet metallic tang we'd noticed in the cabin. It was stronger now. I could taste it, thick on the air. "We need to go." Her voice trembled now. There was no calm, no control. Just fear. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, but where could we go? The nearest town was miles away, and the thought of walking through those silent woods made my skin crawl. But staying wasn't an option. As we debated, the door to the cabin creaked again. This time, it didn't just open. It slammed shut. Hard. We both jumped, our eyes snapping toward the cabin. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cabin just sat there, its windows glaring back at us like cold, dead eyes. But the air around us felt charged, alive, like something was lurking just beyond sight, waiting for us to make a move. And then, the whispering started. It was faint at first, almost like a breeze through the trees, except there was no wind. A low guttural sound, like a voice, but not quite human. It slithered through the air, wrapping around us, seeping into our bones. I grabbed her hand. "We're going now." We didn't even bother locking the car. We started down the path that led back toward the main road, but the farther we walked, the more the woods seemed to close in around us. The trees, once just an unsettling backdrop, now felt like they were looming, shifting in the corner of my vision. The path itself twisted and turned in ways it hadn't when we'd driven up. "Are we going the right way?" she asked, her voice strained. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed. The trees weren't just closing in, they were different. What had once been tall, straight pines now seemed warped, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers. We were walking in circles. I stopped, pulling her close. "This doesn't make sense. We've been walking for almost an hour. We should have reached the main road by now." Her grip tightened on my arm, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. "What do we do?" Before I could answer, the whispering grew louder. Not just one voice anymore, but many. Layered, overlapping, coming from all directions. It was like being surrounded, trapped in a sea of voices, but none of them made sense. The words were garbled, inhuman. And then, from behind us, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the trees, the cabin in the distance, and that unbearable silence pressing in. And then, the footsteps again. This time closer. I didn't wait to see what was coming. We ran, sprinting down the path, desperate to outrun whatever it was that was following us. But no matter how fast we ran, those footsteps, they were always just behind us, matching our pace, getting closer and closer. Finally, we broke through the trees, and there it was, the cabin, right in front of us. My heart sank. We had never left. The door creaked open as we approached, as if it was waiting for us. We stood there, panting, staring at the cabin as if it had somehow moved itself in front of us. My legs felt like they would give out any second, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My wife was shaking beside me, her breath coming out in ragged gasps, eyes locked on that door, still creaking slowly as if beckoning us in. The air felt colder now, the sky darker, though it was only mid-afternoon. The sun had been swallowed by thick clouds that seemed to roll in from nowhere, casting everything in a sickly gray light. I grabbed her arm, my voice barely a whisper. We never left." She didn't respond. I wasn't even sure if she heard me. Her eyes were wide, vacant, like she was trying to process what was happening, trying to fight off the same realization clawing at the edges of my mind. There was no getting away from this place. It had us. The journal flashed through my mind, its final frantic words. "You will never leave. No one leaves." A cold sweat slicked my skin. I looked back at the cabin, half expecting to see something. A shadow in the window, a figure standing in the doorway, but it was just the cabin, old and decrepit, as if mocking us with its stillness. "We can't go back in there," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "We have to keep trying. Maybe we took the wrong turn. Maybe—" Her words cut off as a loud bang erupted from behind us, echoing through the woods like a gunshot. I whipped around, my heart in my throat. Nothing. Just trees. Another bang, this time louder, closer, as if something was slamming itself into the trees, trying to break through. The ground seemed to vibrate with each hit, the air growing heavier and thicker until it felt like we were suffocating. Without thinking, I grabbed her hand and bolted for the cabin. My mind screamed at me that going back inside was the last thing we should do. But those sounds, whatever was out there, whatever was coming, was far worse than the cabin itself. At least inside, we could shut the door, barricade ourselves, try to figure something out. We stumbled up the steps, and I kicked the door closed behind us. The moment it slammed shut, the noises outside stopped. The cabin fell silent again. The only sound was our frantic breathing. The fire was still out, and the room felt darker than it had before, the shadows stretching across the floor like long, clawed hands. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to think, trying to make sense of any of this. "We're trapped," she said, her voice flat. "Aren't we?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The cabin creaked above us, a long, slow groan that sent shivers down my spine. I could hear something moving upstairs. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps like someone or something was pacing, waiting. I glanced at her. Her face had gone pale, her lips trembling. She opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. I knew what she was thinking. The journal. The hermit. The spirit that supposedly haunted this place, that dragged people into its twisted cycle. The footsteps upstairs grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was knew we were back, knew we had come home. My eyes darted to the stairs leading up to the second floor, and a pit formed in my stomach. The air seemed to grow colder with each step it took. I could almost feel it, whatever it was, coming toward us. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. "Yeah, I hear it." And then, the journal. It had mentioned something about a way to stop the cycle, a way to break free, but I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember any of it except the warnings. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear, and then a soft whisper, right behind me. "Stay." I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. There was no one there. The room was empty, but the voice had been real. I wasn't imagining it. I grabbed her arm again. "We need to look at the journal." We rushed back to the kitchen where we had left it, but as soon as we stepped in, we froze. The journal was gone. I blinked, scanning the room, certain it had to be there. We had left it on the table, hadn't we? I knelt down, frantically searching under the table, but it wasn't there. Something wanted us to stay. Something was playing with us. A crash echoed from upstairs, followed by a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My mind raced. Was it the hermit? The vengeful spirit from the journal? But that wasn't possible, was it? Ghosts weren't real. None of this should be real. And yet, here we were, trapped in some sick nightmare. Another sound, this time from the fireplace. A faint scratching, like nails scraping along brick. I turned and my blood went cold. The journal was there, right where the fire should have been, placed carefully in the empty hearth. Its cover was open, the pages fluttering as if touched by an invisible hand. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to go near it, but I had to. I took a step closer, my legs feeling heavy, as if the air itself were weighing me down. As I reached for the journal, the whisper came again, louder this time, closer. Stay with me! I snatched the journal from the hearth, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers, searching for the part about breaking the cycle. There, at the bottom of a torn, ragged page. A single sentence scratched in a shaky hand. The sacrifice must be made. The one who stays will save the other. The cabin creaked again, louder now, as if it was reacting to the words, as if it was listening. My wife looked at me, her eyes filled with horror as she read over my shoulder. What does that mean? I didn't answer, because deep down, I already knew. The words stared back at us, bleeding through the brittle page like they were alive. The sacrifice must be made. The one who stays will save the other. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, like the cabin itself was waiting for us to make a choice. My wife took a step back, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. She knew what it meant too, even though neither of us could bring ourselves to say it out loud.
I'm not staying here,
she whispered, shaking her head. There has to be another way. There has to be. I wanted to agree, to tell her we could figure this out, that there was some way out of this nightmare, but the cold reality of the situation was sinking in, creeping into my bones like the icy wind outside. The journal wasn't some forgotten relic. It was a warning, a set of rules, and those rules had been playing out long before we stepped foot in this cursed place. The footsteps upstairs started again, slow and deliberate, each one like a hammer striking my chest. Whatever was up there, it was waiting. It knew. And the whispering, that damned whispering, growing louder, clearer, filling every corner of the room. Stay. Stay with me. The voice slithered into my ear, so close it felt like cold breath on my neck. I shuddered, glancing back toward the stairs. The shadows at the top twisted and shifted, but nothing appeared. Not yet. My wife's breathing quickened, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. We can't just sit here, she said, panic edging into her voice. We need to get out of here now! I didn't have a better idea. Every instinct screamed to run, to get out, but where? The woods had turned into a labyrinth, twisting and dragging us back here no matter how hard we tried. And something told me that whatever was outside was just as dangerous as the thing inside this cabin. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door, but as I reached for the knob, the floorboards beneath us groaned. Slowly they began to move, shifting, creaking, as though something underneath was coming to life. The entire cabin seemed to shudder, and for a brief moment, I thought the floor was going to swallow us whole. A low, guttural moan echoed through the walls, as if the house itself was in pain. Or maybe hungry. The door burst open on its own with a deafening crash, slamming against the wall. The dark woods yawned beyond, but the darkness that spilled in wasn't just night. It was something deeper, blacker, something alive. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. Not a person, no. This was something else entirely. Its shape flickered, almost like smoke, but there were eyes, burning, hollow eyes, staring at us from the shadows. My wife let out a small scream, backing away from the door, her hand over her mouth. What the hell is that? The thing didn't move, didn't step inside. It just stood there watching, waiting, as if it knew we were trapped, as if it knew this was its game now, and we were just pawns. A cold sweat broke out over me, and for a brief moment, I thought about making a run for it, charging past the thing in the doorway and plunging into the forest. But something held me back, a dark, gnawing certainty that the woods wouldn't save us. They were part of this place, part of him. I glanced back at the journal. The words on the page seemed to shimmer, almost pulsing, as though they were alive. One must stay to save the other. I turned to her, the weight of the choice crashing down like a ton of bricks. It wants one of us to stay, I said, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. She stared at me, shaking her head furiously. No, that's not happening. We both leave. We both get out of here. The cabin groaned again, louder this time, as though it was rejecting her words. The figure in the doorway shifted, just a flicker, but enough to remind us that we weren't alone. And then, upstairs, something began to scrape along the floorboards. That slow, deliberate dragging sound from before, as though something heavy was being pulled toward us. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs now, coming closer with each second. I backed away from the door, the hairs on my arms standing on end. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I could feel it. The inevitability of what was coming. The sacrifice. It wasn't just about staying. It was about becoming part of the cabin, part of the cycle. The journal had said it. No one leaves. Not really. Not unless one stays. My wife was shaking her head again, her eyes filling with tears. No, we're not doing this. I felt the weight of the journal in my hand, its pages curling in the dim light. I could feel the truth in those words. If we didn't make the choice, if neither of us stayed, the cabin would take us both. I stepped forward, the choice hanging heavy in the air. But before I could speak, the scraping upstairs stopped. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. And then, from the top of the stairs, a voice called out. It wasn't the whispering this time. It wasn't the voice of the cabin. It was her voice, my wife's voice, calling my name. I froze. My blood turned to ice as I turned slowly toward the staircase. She was beside me. I could feel her trembling. But that voice came from upstairs. A soft laugh echoed from the darkness at the top of the stairs. Her laugh. Come upstairs, the voice said, low and sweet. It's okay. Everything's going to be okay. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because the thing standing at the top of the stairs wasn't her. It was me, smiling. I stood frozen, staring at the impossible sight before me. At the top of the stairs, in the shadows, stood a figure that looked exactly like me. My face, my clothes, everything, but twisted. The smile was too wide, the eyes too dark. It was wrong, all of it. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin cold with terror. The figure at the top of the stairs tilted its head, that sick grin widening. Come upstairs, it said again in my voice, mocking me. Everything will be fine. My wife tightened her grip on my arm, her breath shallow, her body trembling. I could feel her fear matching my own, but deep down something shifted inside me. A flicker of anger, a spark of defiance. Whatever this thing was, this cabin, this spirit, this cycle, it had been playing with us from the start, but I wasn't going to let it win. I wasn't going to lose her. No, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We're not playing your game anymore. The figure's smile faltered, just for a second, and I saw it. The power of the cabin, the spirit, it wasn't invincible. It was feeding on our fear, feeding on the choices we thought we had to make. But we had a choice. We always did. The cabin groaned again, louder this time as if in protest. The walls seemed to shudder, the floor creaking beneath our feet, but I held my ground. I squeezed my wife's hand and took a step forward, toward the thing that wore my face. We're leaving, I said, my voice growing stronger. Both of us. You don't get to keep us here. The figure at the top of the stairs laughed, the sound twisting into something high and unnatural, almost like a shriek. The shadows around it deepened, swirling like a living thing. And for a moment, I thought it would lunge at us, tear us apart right where we stood. But then, something incredible happened. The journal in my hand, the old, brittle pages, began to glow. A soft golden light emanated from it, filling the room with warmth. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us lifted, and the air became easier to breathe. My wife gasped beside me, her fear giving way to something else. Hope. I looked down at the journal, its pages fluttering in the soft glow. The words that had been scrawled in terror, warnings of death and sacrifice, began to change. The ink shifted, new words forming in their place, clear and steady. The curse can be broken. The truth must be spoken. The figure at the top of the stairs screeched, its form flickering, distorting. I felt the cabin shudder beneath us, the shadows clawing at the edges of the room, desperate to hold on. I stepped forward again, holding the journal up like a shield. You were a man once, I said, the words coming to me without thought. A man who lived here, a man who died here. But you don't have to keep doing this. You don't have to take anyone else. The figure trembled, its shape unraveling at the edges. For a moment I saw it, not the twisted version of me, but a man, a broken, lonely man, consumed by anger and pain. The hermit, the one who had been trapped in this cycle, lashing out at anyone who came near, desperate to be free. You can let go, I whispered. Let go and we'll go too. No one else has to suffer. The light from the journal grew brighter, filling the room, chasing away the shadows. The cabin groaned again, but this time it was different. Softer, almost like a sigh. The figure at the top of the stairs gave one final piercing cry before it dissolved, the darkness lifting from the room like smoke in the wind. And just like that, the air felt clean. Clear. The oppressive weight was gone. I turned to my wife, her eyes wide with disbelief. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. But the cabin felt different now. Lighter. The walls weren't closing in. The whispers had faded. We stepped out onto the porch, the cool air hitting our faces, and for the first time since we arrived, the world felt normal. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a warm orange glow over the trees. Birds chirped in the distance. The woods, once so menacing, now felt peaceful. The car started without a hitch. We didn't look back as we drove down the gravel road, away from cabin 13. But as we reached the edge of the woods, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, but different now. It looked at peace. The shadows were gone, and in the fading light, it looked like any other cabin. I squeezed my wife's hand, relief washing over me. We had broken the cycle. As we drove away, the last rays of sunlight glinted off the journal in my lap. The words had changed again. The final message clear and simple. You are free. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it.